it seems to me that every year we have this annual existential debate, aren't we? Who are we? What are we doing here? What is our purpose? Why is it so? And I don't know whether those, angst-ridden Professor Sumner Miller tones are really coming from the trustees and people who work in the sector, if not from the outside. But nevertheless, Mr Hockey has said the ageing of the population ought to make Australians think seriously about what they expect from the superannuation system. Alex, what should they expect?
Well, the whole point of this time is to talk about, does super have a bigger role? And the answer is no, it does not have a bigger role. It is about retirement savings, full stop. That's it. But that is the wrong question. So I think our dear Treasurer misspoke. He didn't do a Brian Williams, he didn't misremember, he just misspoke.
Right.
The real issue is how can you harness this amazing system that helps people save money, that puts it in, that reaches into the pay packets and the workplaces of millions of Australians. How can you use that infrastructure to encourage people to save more? That is the real opportunity, and that is, I think, what Mr Hockey really, really meant. He just couldn't quite articulate it.
Hang on. He meant, well, can I have a crack at what Mr Hockey meant to say? Now, let's be charitable. Perhaps Mr Hockey was saying, so in the beginning, there was the kind of Homer Simpson who came out of the cave, and he went to work and his wife wondered why she couldn't, but nevertheless. And there came a moment when there was a party and there was a watch. We've jumped forward from the rock ages, the Stone Age. And that point marked retirement. And then there was a part where there was no work, and we called that retirement. And if that defined moment with the party and the wristwatch no longer occurs anymore, do we need a sole purpose test anymore? And therefore, let's open up the question of what is superannuation for? Is that perhaps what Mr Hockey was thinking?
I'd say yes, but if you want to start doing more things and dipping into that money, we're going to need to save a lot more than 10%. Part of this discussion, we got into the idea of, well, it works in Singapore. They have this fantastic system where they have retirement, they have health savings, they have education savings.
They also sacrifice 37% of their pay packet.
Exactly. It's 4 times what we put into our superannuation savings system. So if we want to go down the Singapore road, and that would be a fantastic thing to do, we are going to need to save a lot more money than we do now through superannuation. So you've got to get that in your head first.
Garry, can I jump over to you? I'll come back to you, Rosemary. Is this an issue of really needing to nail this down, to codify once and for all for those who are confused, those doing remedial superannuation? What is it about? And what if the definition was retirement income, which is what David Murray said, exactly what Alex said. It's pretty simple, guys, retirement income, and to provide a pool of funds to profitably invest for the benefit of the nation. What if it did that? Would that be a breakthrough in terms of coalescing around, yep, that's what it's for, let's all move forward?
Well, I think most of the confusion about what it's for comes between political parties, not from the industry. I think there's pretty much clarity that we're there to maximise the long-term benefits for the membership, for the people that are part of the system, and that it is part of a socially regulated system, and therefore we have to put up with the fact that governments will, from time to time, get themselves involved unnecessarily as well as necessarily, because it does require regulation. But the thing is that it's so big now, and it's on the way to being so much bigger if the current government doesn't stop it from getting much bigger. It's on the way to being so much bigger that of course there's a bigger role. I mean, I don't know if I'm really disagreeing with Alex, but of course there's a bigger role.
But Nick, the other possibility is that there's a smaller role. The other possibility is the beating drum of people saying, we can't afford this standard of living anymore. We just got a demographic report that says the number of 65-year-olds is going to double. And there is no longer a social contract that says, yep, I'm prepared to sacrifice for that for my retirement. I want it for my education. I want it for my HECS. I want it for my first home deposit. How hard is that going to be able to resist politically?
Well, I think 2 points. I'm very strongly of the view mandatory superannuation is for retirement. We're not quite there yet in the sense that it's a lump sum, but it is for retirement. That is well codified in the Superannuation Guarantee Act. It's well codified in the SIS Act. And I would never want to see that change. I think the philosophical, practical justifications for compulsion around savings for retirement is very compelling. Once you open it up to all sorts of other uses, and we do to some extent, unfortunately, for example, death and disability insurance and some level of early access, but it's about savings for retirement. And the centrality should always be that. I'm strongly opposed to any change.
The question was, if people have to paying $100,000 to get a higher education at a university, paying more for vet, housing prices keep going up, the planning system doesn't keep up with it, is there going to be an irresistible call on these funds?
Well, it shouldn't be via the retirement income system.
It shouldn't be.
I accept.
That's not the question. The question is, will it be?
Well, I hope not. It should not be via a retirement income system, which is their long-term investment for retirement income. There is a perfectly legitimate debate, and in fact one I've been deeply involved in the countries I've worked in the last 3 years, about the long-term sustainability of a retirement income system in any advanced economy because of the current construct. It's age-based access. It's not just longevity we're dealing with. The other most profound and radical change has been the collapse in the birth rate. And so the dependency ratio, I think we're all pretty familiar with that. I would argue, therefore, that yes, we should be seriously concerned about the sustainability of any retirement income system given those pressures.
Okay, so
but therefore, you will have to deal with issues around whole-of-life learning. You'll have to deal with issues around improved aged care and parental leave, because we do know that that's very necessary. We pay peanuts in this country at the moment.
So can I move to Rosemary? So therefore, if you have to deal with those issues and you start to use superannuation to do that, superannuation into housing, do you start to be able to make a new deal with those young people who found the Treasurer's thought bubble appealing? Do you start to make a new deal with them that says, we'd be better off to ease the squeeze on you with impact investing of superannuation than have you pull the $30,000 out of your piddling little balance over there, and that's the new deal?
Well, I think we do need to engage with young people about what superannuation is about, but I think that there is a consensus it is about retirement and retirement incomes. The part of the question you're asking is what should we use those funds for, which is a bit of a different question. And I think that there is a consensus about the retirement income taking the pressure off the age pension. There's a couple of things I would say also. There's a few things that it's not about, but which it has become about, like being a tax shelter for very high income earners to put money, or wealthy people, to put money into super and use it as a tax shelter, for it to be a mechanism for estate planning for those people as well. So there's things that we can do to make sure that it is genuinely about providing retirement incomes. The part of your question relating to should we use it to provide social capital, I think that yes, we should, but that shouldn't be mandated, because the quote that you read out from the Murray report was we should be using that for building capital within Australia. Well, the situation is that there is almost $2 trillion in superannuation in Australia. Australia is too small to accommodate all of that money in terms of investment. So we need to
just for clarity, that wasn't David Murray's definition, that was just something I was coming up with.
Oh, right, okay.
Around the point of, do we not have consensus on this after all these years?
But Alan, I think that I agree with all of that, by the way, I strongly agree with those points. But the thing is that in some of these big social questions, like housing and other things, health and so on, the industry is so big it has a responsibility to try and address some of those issues. And that's where I think we have...
Does it? Because I thought it had a sole purpose test.
Well,
I thought that was clear.
There's no need to have any conflict with the sole purpose test to address those things. I mean, you still have the choice. For example, you have to make a choice. I've got $1 here. Will I put it in tobacco,
alcohol and uranium?
or will I put it in some other more socially useful area if I can get a reasonable return? That's the question. So it's not a question about let's put money into areas where we can't. That's not the question. But we know that one of the few asset classes in Australia, for example, that has not been commoditised by the funds management industry is housing, residential housing. But if we don't do anything about trying to address that issue, then we've got to expect that politicians...
That's a really good point to make. I saw a report this morning from the UK. Last year there was articles discussing how pension funds collectively had put about $30 billion into residential housing investment projects. That doesn't happen in Australia. And I think a big part of the point you're making, Ellen, is superannuation needs its social licence.
Yes.
We love bagging the financial planners. We love bagging all these other people about how they've squandered their social licence. And Nikki's right that there's all this legislation behind what superannuation does, and it's a good thing and it will probably not change. However, who cares about that? You actually got to have the moral authority to speak and to do and to be.
And miners talk about that as a ticket from the government to operate and a social licence to operate, which must be negotiated
trust super,
all
we've
the
got to
time.
start doing it. But you sort of come into the point, and I got to admit I got this idea from an article written by a very wise journalist I saw last week, Alan Kohler. He did some analysis of some investment returns, and what he was saying, and he's exactly right. Over the last 10 years, the average default super fund has pulled in 6.4% per annum after fees and taxes and charges, all that sort of stuff. That is exactly what the ABS housing price index has returned over 10 years.
And therefore?
So investing in housing is actually a really good investment, subject to tax issues and all that sort of stuff. But if we're going to put 10% into super, it's not enough to start paying for housing. So if we want people to start trusting the superannuation industry, we've got to start doing intelligent things with that money, and they've got to see it, so we've got to earn that licence. And I think a big part of this discussion is we are scared that if we lose this licence, we need the regulations to protect us, and if you need the government to protect you, it's all over.
But I would argue trustees can do this at the moment for the reason, if you look back at representative trustees 30 years ago when I first became involved, community attitudes then are very different from that which they are today around environmental issues, social investment, etc. And trustees are representative. They represent the changing views of the community, particularly in a mandatory system. I think it's perfectly reasonable for trustees in today's world to take a much more broader view of a fiduciary duty as a trustee representing their members. And I don't see any particular issue or problem with that. That's an evolution as the community attitude has changed.
So to give us some examples, you were citing some examples earlier of the Gold Coast Hospital and the Adelaide Hospital. What happened there that meant that what this vision that you're talking about was realised in those infrastructure projects?
Well, I think government of the day, and look, I accept it's controversial. We had an interesting discussion about this via email. But government of the day took a decision. Resources are limited. The best approach was to provide, in Adelaide is a good example, I think. The private sector will build and the super funds will invest in the hospital, actually construct it. There'll be a return back to the super funds, and the medical staff equipment will be provided by government and other services will be contracted out. Now that's a controversial element of it, I know, but that's a new approach. I think the most interesting area is in social housing, where social housing is being passed over generally to not-for-profits or profit for members, and we haven't yet seen that housing stock being utilised as a base for investment. And the social bonds we touched on earlier are a useful way in which you will be able to reinvest back in housing stock. We're not quite at that point, but they're new. PPPs are not new developments, but I think there are useful ways in which trustees thinking about their members. I mean, you're representing your members, and I think members some of them at least, are interested in this approach.
And what did you reply on the email that started the exchange, Rosemary?
Well, I just don't agree that PPPs are social impact investing. I think there's a continuum, and PPPs are probably on the end where we have private for-profit providers involved. In Victoria, we had a PPP in the Latrobe Valley, which was a public hospital run by the private sector, brought back into the public sector because of various problems with the way that hospital run.
And so what's your objection to it?
No one wants to bring airports back under the control of the Federal Airports Corporation.
No, but I think
public... It would shrink the workforce,
if we're talking...
it would shrink the traffic, you know. So, look, it's just ridiculous to have an argument about this in the broad, you know, in the theoretical.
No, but I think if we're talking about social services and services to society, such as education, health and community services, that's where, in my view, there's a big difference. And the development of social bonds by the New South Wales government in the fields of community development, I think, is a very exciting development, where the New South Wales government is looking at social impacts from investing in not-for-profit organisations which deliver services which are designed to reduce long-term costs to government. For example, the new PIN example in New South Wales was $7 million raised from funds, which was then used to support families with young children who were at risk. And the government sees a return as those children not going into care, so there's a whole way in which we can value those returns, and the New South Wales government shares those returns with the investors.
And so what's the...
7 million, I mean, like...
It's small.
I know. I think it's a good experiment.
Baby
don't get me wrong.
steps.
I think they're good experiments. But
what sort of dollars are you looking to invest?
Well, people publish, the business community and as well as governments and governments agencies publish the infrastructure deficit, you know, over the next 20 years between 100 billion and 800 billion. Right, so that is a sort of that is impactful issue. Like, that is where you can have an impact. Are we going to try and address that? Now, it's not the case that all should be provided by the public. On my own view, for example, is debt's very cheap at the moment. You know, the bond rates are very low. If governments feel able to borrow and tax to service all that, then they should go and get on with it and do it. But if they can't, they have to find more creative ways to bring the private sector into it.
And should industry super rule itself out of that because there are union members on the board?
They're not going to rule themselves out of it. My argument would be the opposite. My argument would be, if we could come up with an appropriate mutualisation model, which was what I've been writing about recently, a mutualisation model, it is a far better solution than selling out to organisations simply interested in a transaction profit, or to organisations that have no interest in the long-term operation and control of those assets.
And on that basis, Alex, should industry funds, what view should they take of if the poles and wires in New South Wales are up for grabs? They've got a long-term view. Would the people in New South Wales rather have them owned by a super fund?
The politics of how privatisation seems to have become the personification of evil, I just find that amazing how that debate has cropped up so quickly. I totally get the politics of that, but it's just come out of nowhere, and it's just all credit to the people running those campaigns. However, the thing that's, I think, a little bit odd is that, well, it's not odd, but if people on superannuation boards, they're there to represent members. They're not there to sort of play the politics. It comes back to what the trustee role is. When you're on the trustee board, you're there as a trustee. And if there's a good investment up for grabs and you think that makes sense as a fiduciary, then you're part of that game. You go out to play. But you've got to also start to think about, well, of course industry funds should be involved in those investment opportunities. But even picking up some of the points that Rosemary has said, just say a bunch of super funds got together and snapped up every social bond that we could possibly think of in Australia. What would that be? 50, 60, 70 billion dollars? It's going to be small beer. The superannuation sector in Australia right now is just a whisker short of $2 trillion. Over the next 2 decades, even if it has conservative growth, it'll be somewhere between $6 and $8 trillion. What's $6 or $8 trillion between a few people such as us? We're running out of things to invest that money in Australia. We have All you funds, you send people around the world every week of the year looking for places to invest the money. Your biggest problem is not where to put the money you have today. Your biggest problem is where you're going to put it in 5 years' time. We are going to become the Benelux of the Asia Pacific. We are going to be exporting capital. We haven't even begun to think about how that is going to turn the macroeconomics of this country upside down and inside out. And what a fantastic set of problems to have. And social bonds and impact investing is part of the many solutions. And it's a fantastic idea. So as Garry says, trustees, get creative and just get on with it.
Look, on the politics, it's perfectly reasonable for, say, a trustee who is an official of the Electrical Trade Union in New South Wales in that capacity to oppose privatisation. That's a political debate, and that's whichever side you fall on. Once the decision's made, however, and government of the day either rises or falls and decides to privatise the wire and the poles, it is the fiduciary duty of the trustee, who may in another capacity have opposed the privatisation, to walk into that boardroom and make an investment decision, provided the commercials stack up.
I don't think there's any doubt that union-nominated trustees and employer-nominated trustees hang their hats outside the boardroom door. I don't think there's any doubt about that, and I think that needs to be said, given the political issues around board composition and trustee boards. On the question of if something is profitable, then we should grab it, I disagree with that, because I think we need to take into account the ESG issues. We need to look at the social impact of the investments that we're making. As universal investors and universal owners, big funds that have $50 billion, $60 billion, $70 billion in their investment portfolios need to be looking at where the impact of those investments are falling. So I'm not narrowing it down to looking at impact investment bonds, but more broadly, what sort of society do we want, or do our members want to retire into when they retire? And how can we improve the society that they're going to retire into, bearing in mind the returns, the risks and the costs of investment? And as Garry says, if we have an alternative to putting $1 here or $1 there, then we do make decisions based on principles, and we do make decisions based on what is the second order, third order impact that our investments decisions will have.
Now, I'm just looking at the board here, and I think we've got a literal in the question. Is it now, no it isn't, is it now society's or super's role to protect the disadvantaged rather than the government? Anyone want to grab that one?
That's an easy question. It's the government's role. It's not superannuation's responsibility, but they can play a part of that answer, absolutely.
We're all part of the community, aren't we? I mean, we all are part of a community. And so you can't just simply say, the politicians, at the moment we don't think they're getting it right on this, so therefore it can all go to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah.
We're all part of the community. But can I just say one thing in addition to Alex's point, that, and I agree, by the way, with Rosemary's comments, but the extent and importance of what Alex is saying the penny hasn't dropped in government yet, because can I just make this point? We spent this morning, a lot of it, talking about what is going to take the place in terms of jobs. What is the industry and sector that is going to give us a comparative advantage that we can build to replace or mitigate our reliance on commodities? What is it? The obvious one is financial services.
Yeah.
Obvious. Well paid, highly paid, sometimes too highly paid jobs.
We ran a story in Financial Standards today about what some of the most depressed people in the workforce right now are financial service executives. And my heart just dropped.
Yeah. So, it is the fastest growing sector. It's the fastest growing sector. Yeah. And why we spend all our time running around worrying about whether we should attract or keep a multinational company churning out cars that no one wants, and instead of thinking about the advantages of what we have got, is beyond me.
If I can just pick that point up, the mining industry is a great example. 80% of the mining industry is owned by foreign companies, which is a fantastic thing. We're an open architecture economy. We don't want the same thing to happen to financial services, where 80% of us is owned by offshore investors. Can we somehow get a piece of that? And this is the sort of stuff that we should be talking about at a national level, absolutely.
There's a couple more questions on the screen, but can I just ask one more, and that is, For those watching Q&A, you'll remember there was an exchange between John Daly from the Grattan Institute and the Treasurer, where the Treasurer was talking about, being an infrastructure government, and Daly was saying, yes, except for the fact that you haven't built anything, was sort of, that's kind of a short view of what he was saying. Where are the opportunities for this, notwithstanding some good but small fry New South Wales bonds, where are the opportunities for this sort of impact investment? Are they sufficient, or do industry funds have to suddenly find the wherewithal to turn themselves into a James Packer and turn up and say, guess what, you need a new casino at Barangaroo. Have I got a plan for you? Here it is.
Well, we've got a need to, just one example, we have a need currently to, increase the capacity of the Victorian or Melbourne public transport system by 20 or 30%, and we clearly haven't got the funds to do it. So why aren't we turning our creativity to how we can do that?
Well, what's the answer? Why is that not? Where's the blockage?
We can't invest. I can't go along and say, right, I'm going to invest in that tunnel, that rail tunnel.
Well, can't you say you ought to have a rail tunnel here?
They haven't decided to build it.
But governments have to lead in that infrastructure space, for example. That's just one area, but governments have to lead. So instead of arguing about whether they will only build roads and not rail, if they could spend some time on actually thinking about creative ways it's not one-way street either. It's not about creative ways to get the private sector involved in these activities. What about getting the public sector involved in areas where they should be much more involved, like urban planning? But what about creative partnerships?
Well,
is there all the nonsense we go
Nick,
on?
Is there a role for industry super? Notwithstanding the fact that you have to be low cost and you've got to keep your costs down and all the rest of it, to be going to government and saying, Packer style, have I got a plan for you?
Well, I think from everything I've seen as a minister and from everything I've seen of the industry and Garry and others, they do that. They go to government at the moment and advocate particular proposals and projects. At the end of the day, it's up to government to act, to determine that these projects will be made available. They may be privatised entity, airports, ports, whatever. They may be new projects, but government's got to provide those projects and also the construct to allow the investment to take place commercially.
I agree with Garry that it's a failure of planning largely, and we have ad hoc decision making. And the East-West Tunnel is a good example, a good case study of poor decision making, where we know that the ultimate, when Infrastructure Australia ran their microscope over it, didn't stack up, and yet we have the Prime Minister saying that the Victorian election is a referendum on the East-West Tunnel, or the East-West link. So I think we lack that step of planning. And there are funds there within super funds to invest, but it has to be on the basis of planning and of a project that stacks up.
And Alex, so in that sense, do you agree that industry super logically has to be a follower?
Well, I think it's not just industry super, I think it's all sides of the superannuation industry. And I do find it sort of, it just sort of paints the picture of what a thought leader the industry super fund sector has been, that every time even our current government wants to talk about raising investment capital, it goes cap in hand to the industry funds. It doesn't go cap in hand to Colonial First State and AMP. They should be part of that discussion, but they're just not. So it's led by industry funds. But the big economic missed opportunity is every time we think about trying to do something to the economy, we think about, well, what's the banking sector going to do? What's the banking sector going to do? And hey, what's the banking sector going to do? Superannuation is almost as big as the banking sector now, but it's not part of the economic armoury in how we control the economy. We've got to somehow go from being on the whinging side of the budget table in Canberra every May to being on the decision-making side of the table.
How does that happen?
Well, I think we've just been house-trained. We're a child of regulation, and it gets to the point where super funds can't scratch their backsides without getting a signed affidavit from ASIC or APRA. And when you're so house-trained, you can't think outside the square. And you've got too many accountants and lawyers.
It's a little harsh, Alex. So, look, I've been a minister sitting there when Garry and lots of others in this room have been in my door just as effectively as the banking lobby sector. banks are important, and they're a very, very powerful group in our economic and social structure. We shouldn't underestimate them, but I don't see any shrinking violence, Garry or otherwise, from the superannuation sector right across the board. I mean, I think now, given the growth, the presence is very strong and a very powerful advocate.
But if I can tell you one, I live in Canberra, so if I'm speaking too fast for everybody, just let me know and I'll slow down. When I left the former regulator to go and work at Rainmaker, so this is quite a few years ago now, but I was chatting to a friend of mine who had gone into one of the high-end policy areas of Treasury, and we're talking about how do you harness investments and blah, blah, blah. And he looked at me across the lunch table, he pointed his finger and he said, "Alex, you tell your friends in the superannuation industry that we give them tax concessions and it's time they stop coming cap in hand asking for more tax breaks. We're sick of it. You tell your friends to just get lost."
But Alex, there's two issues there.
I was amazed that he said this to me, and I was amazed that he was saying that this is my money. He's just the dude from Treasury. It's not his money at all. But I was amazed by the narrative of that.
But Alex, there's two issues here. One is, look, everyone in this room is focused on investment in infrastructure in some way, shape or form. The superannuation industry as a whole, and particularly the industry funds, have taken a leadership and done what has been required when the projects have been offered to them. The other complaint about the super industry going to Canberra, and I mean I've seen enough of it over the years, give us another tax concession, increase the contribution rate, etc., etc. Well, I do think the industry does overdo it a bit from time to time. You can make a claim, and I'm not particularly talking about the SG here, I'm talking about issues around tax concessionality, which have now become, I think, just utterly unsustainable and inappropriate and unfair. But, they put their views, and at the end of the day, did I listen to my public servants? Rarely.
So anyone else on that point?
I think it's a misconception to think that the funds, or the industry funds, are there advocating for themselves as funds. I would say that all industry funds advocate for their members and the benefits to their members, and certainly that's what the funds that I've ever been involved with have done. They don't go cap in hand to government asking for something for themselves.
We've never ever asked, by the way, for all those ideas about infrastructure bonds and tax. We've never ever asked for any of that. We've asked for one thing: would governments please facilitate projects that we can invest in?
So you say
please make something happen so we can invest in it. That's what we've asked for. Yeah. That's what we've asked for. Nothing else. That's what we've asked for.
And the industry funds invest. And do it, I think, very effectively. Look at the long-term rates of return of the investment decisions that industry funds have made. It's first class.
There's a provocative question on screen. The average member wants the best return on their investment. Do they really care if it has social or environmental consequences? The number of members in ESG options in funds says no.
Yeah, well, I think that's a reasonable point of view. But we are supposed to be leading an industry. It's an industry with $2 trillion. We better have some ethics to guide us, or else we'll lose control of that industry, and rightly. And it might well be that many people don't think too much about their daily lives. That's why you have laws and guidance of people. That's why you have that. But if that's the case of the average member, it's not the case of all the members. I think a lot of the times they don't invest in ESG options is because they simply don't understand it.
Why does investing in ESG lose your money? It doesn't have to lose your money at all.
No, that's right.
It's a totally spurious debate that investing ethically costs you money. It can make you money.
But I go back to my earlier point. When I was a trustee 30 years ago, did we sit around as trustees talking about ESG, the environment, social considerations? No, we didn't. The world has changed enormously in the last 30 years. Does the general populace, the members of the funds out there, broadly think and consider and care more about those issues in today's world? Yes, they do. Therefore, the trustees, as representative trustees, should be thinking and caring and at least taking those issues into consideration when they make investment decisions.
But Nick,
today.
it gets hard, and we sort of had half this conversation before. It gets hard in the detail, doesn't it? Saying that you look after members, everybody agrees on that. Motherhood's
the detail's always tough. That's why you're a trustee.
Thing.
That's your obligation to do the best you can as a trustee. It's tough. It's not an easy world.
So Garry, let's take the we wicked example of the New South Wales poles and wires. If you're begging them for an opportunity to invest in infrastructure, if you've got a populace who are concerned about profit taking at the expense of running the heater in the wintertime, is that a role for trust?
Well, when you come down to specific, to specific things, there are very specific things. There are very specific factors involved. And, I actually cannot talk specifically about that. Because
all right, well, let's pretend that Queensland suddenly got a fever for privatisation and they want to...
Just let me make this observation. There are special things affecting the electricity industry. So one of the things affecting the poles and wire debate, for example, is the fact that because of the fall-off in manufacturing, because of the advance of energy-saving devices, and because of the rise of solar rooftop, there are less people taking their power from the grid and less people to pay.
Still a profitable business. It's still a hugely profitable business.
There are big issues in there about whether it will be a good investment or not a good investment, and there are big guesses about whether it will be good or bad economically in the long run to have it in this hand or the other. There's plenty of arguments to say that, that where it has been privatised, the actual price has been lower, but that doesn't mean to say that'll be the case here, so that's a very specific set and there's very different opinions about it. So I think, it just has to play out, but what we have to do is get a better model of taking the public with us in terms of them being confident that when the private sector is involved in public infrastructure issues, they're involved in a way that is good for the public in the long term. That's why mutualisation is the way to go, in my opinion.
Well, so then when you go to government, you don't just say, give us something we can invest in. You say, give us something we can invest in on our terms.
Well, we're not going to, because of this question here, which is perfectly correct. People want to make sure they get a good rate of return. So, of course.
No, on our terms in terms of a mutual investment, on our terms in terms of it has to be good for all of the people of New South Wales, not just our members.
Look, the first thing that any of the funds that are investing money will do, they'll make a risk-reward judgment. And sometimes they get it wrong, sometimes they get it right. But they will make that judgment. So if it doesn't stack up at all on risk and return, and that's plain, then obviously it can't happen. But governments are in a position to use, first of all, their own balance sheet, to put money themselves or use the power of their balance sheet and their borrowing capacity. They've got enormous regulatory powers. They've got suasive powers. They can take states and local governments who always, it's not just the federal government, state and states.
And therefore what? If you're looking for things to invest in?
They can allocate risks. What they can do as a government is negotiate and allocate the risks so that the risks are appropriately allocated with the rewards. They can put a floor under returns. They can put a collar at returns and make sure the taxpayers share in any excess returns. Or they can do the opposite, in which they can be just totally unpredictable, as we've seen in Australia, completely unpredictable in their regulations and their policies, and destroy investments. They can do either.
And is that a roadblock, Alex, do you think, for this kind of impact investment in big infrastructure?
I'd say yes, but also raises the question that there's a big difference between what is a really great nation-building project and what's a good investment. And a classic example is the very fast train project. You look at the rate at which, say, China is building fast trains, and there's even an idea for India to build a fast train. And I love going to South Asia. I think it's a really important in every way for Australia to understand more about the region. But I'm not so sure whether a fast train is their number one priority. That's the thing that sort of got me. There's even an idea someone put up about building a fast train to take you from China to America. And that just blew my head apart when I read that.
We've got a guy building the Titanic. I don't think we can comment.
Okay. But the fast train project is really,
guaranteed loss, Loza.
It's really instructional.
Gary's not interested. Yeah, go.
It's instructional because it sort of highlights that just because something makes a lot of nation-building sense doesn't mean, as Garry was saying, you can actually build an investment proposition around it. There might be an investment proposition around, say, running it or having some ownership somewhere along the way. So governments need to work with in the same way they work with the banking sector, to work with this new pool of capital, which is as big as the banking sector, will probably become bigger, to try and figure out, these people have trillions of dollars to invest, how can we get a little piece of that? And so it's trying to work out that super funds buy and sell bits of paper. They don't really want a bridge, they want the bit of paper that represents the bridge. And so it's about how do you harness that, and that's where the conversation gets really, really hard, absolutely.
And just, unless anyone else wants to...
I was just going to say that, well, governments can make decisions on major projects that they want built, which may have a long-term social benefit, and how they structure their offerings and how they underpin the revenue streams is going to make a big difference as to whether or not super funds or any other investor is going to invest in those projects. So it's a matter of how you construct the proposition and how you construct the income streams, and that might be that government underpins something because it has a 40, 50, 60-year benefit out there. That's how you do it. So it's not just an either or. Either it's not profitable or it is profitable.
There's a very good question at the top of the screen here. We've heard about the issues. Could the panel give at least one or two ideas for funds to do now, Nick?
Well, in what particular area are we talking about? Infrastructure or social?
Impact investing, I'd say.
Investment. Look, I think social housing is a really important, useful area. I think funds should look long and hard at that, because the model that's being developed, the management model, is in transition. I think that's a very, very useful and interesting area to look at.
Do you agree, Garry?
Yeah, I think we should, and I've said this every year for 5 years, but no one's tended to disagree, but it hasn't been done yet. I think one of the things, just one, there's a lot of things we could do, but one is we could thoroughly research in a collective way, because there must be investors, actual funds involved in this, and it can't be just funds. So you need fund manager, you may need a bank. So I think we should be investigating the concept, or a concept, of shared equity with our members in their homes. I think we should be saying it doesn't all have to be debt, it can be shared equity, because the problem for the residential property is the units are so small, and how do you look after them or ensure they're looked after? And the best way to do that is to have the people that own them look after them.
And so what's the proposition to the member?
So the proposition for the member is, I can't currently afford a house.
Yep.
The bank will loan me X, which represents 60% or 70 or 80% of a particular house, or usually less, and I haven't got the balance to go. The funds will collectively take a position in it. So that the funds can get an exposure, not to a house or even an area or one street, but across the nation, and be partners with their members in home ownership.
And it would be with...
And share in the upside, because the underlying point being made here is that land values have consistently appreciated, not in every period. They will still go down. Now, it might go down the next 3 years, but so what? This is about...
And Australians, if anything, they do understand that. They do understand.
It goes up over time.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's very practical ways in which super funds can look at impacting investing and partnering with not-for-profits to deliver projects that are going to save government money. Things like, for example, some of the impact investing bonds that New South Wales government has looked at are around domestic violence. So there are big social issues that super funds can look at partnering with other organisations to deliver and then pitch to the governments who are offering these social benefit bonds. So I think that's a very practical thing that can be done now.
But I would say, as the panel has said, if you want to get government's attention, if you want to get the community's attention, and if you want to get the attention of young people, youngsters, you know you're getting old when you call young people youngsters. If you want to get their attention, talk about, can we do something about housing? You do that and you will run the table.
And we shouldn't kid ourselves, even though I don't agree with what Hockey's floated. It is politically popular. Don't kid yourself. It is very politically popular.
And it goes to that question of social licence. I'd just be fascinated, before we wrap up, to hear your views of Garry's idea. No doubt you've heard it before.
Yeah, look, I agree with Garry. There's not much that Garry and I disagree with on, actually, over the years. But yeah, look, I think the caution in all this debate is the reality that really concerns me, that, I seriously question whether retirement income systems, pensions, super, as they're currently constructed with the parameters they have, can survive. Because
that's a cheery note to end on.
It's a very depressing note. But because we do need to make a massive transfer of allocation of resources, individual and public, to some of the areas we've been talking about: public education, whole of life learning, improved childcare, improved parental leave to at least address the decline in the birth rate, disability pension, disability provision.
And aren't they all the sorts of things that we've been discussing that impact investment at the rate of bonds and all sorts of other things super could be involved in?
Yeah, well, no.
Reinforcing its role.
I think they're legitimate policy issues that have to be addressed and paid for largely by government and taxes. That's where the policy pressure and political pressure will be. The cost will be truly massive. I mean, what we are providing in the way of childcare and parental leave, frankly, is peanuts. It is peanuts. We have to do far more. The similarly depressing point I would end on is how do you pay for it? Well, the reality is retirement income systems in advanced economies are fundamentally about paying people not to work for 20 to 25 years. And I cannot see how that is going to survive given all the other pressures.
Someone else must have a final view on that.
Just childcare facilities might have been better off in the hands of super funds than ABC Learning.
Please thank the members of the panel very much for that spirited discussion.